An economy can grow for many different reasons, but which reasons are the most important? Not the ones you might think. Consider, for example, the discovery of new natural resources such as lumber, oil, silver, or copper. This would seem to be a primary basis for economic growth. It is true that newly discovered resources sometimes create a temporary spurt of economic activity. For example, oil discoveries in the North Sea in the 1970s helped increase real GDP in Norway, England, and several other countries. But newly available natural resources are not a key determinant of long-term growth. Many countries grow for decades or longer without significant new discoveries of natural resources. Being rich in natural resources can help explain a high real GDP, but it cannot explain a continually growing real GDP. In fact, some countries with only small quantities of natural resources, such as South Korea or Japan, have grown rapidly and become rich. And some countries with ample supplies of natural resources, such as Belize and Nigeria, have remained poor. Another possible source of growth is a rising population. It is true that with more people, a country can produce more goods and services, but a rising population does not provide the type of growth economists are looking for. A rising population causes real GDP to grow, but it does not cause real GDP per capita to grow. Remember that it is real GDP per capita that determines a country's standard of living because that is the measure of how much output is available for the average person. For real GDP per capita to rise, the average person in the economy must produce more output. Simply having more people does not make output per person grow. If natural resource discoveries and rising population don't explain rising living standards, then what does? Economists who study economic growth focus on one key factor: labor productivity. Productivity is the amount of output the average worker can produce in an hour. It is calculated by dividing a country's total output of goods and services by the total number of hours it takes to produce it. For example, suppose the United States produces $14 trillion of real GDP in a year, measured in 2005 dollars, using 350 billion labor hours. Then U.S. productivity is $14 trillion divided by 350 billion, which would equal $40. As long as people continue to work the same number of hours, an increase in productivity, output per worker per hour, will cause an increase in real GDP per capita, output per person per year. In growing countries, productivity rises year after year, but its rate of increase can vary. The figure that is in front of you shows the average annual increases in U.S. productivity by decade. As you can see, from 1960 to 2009, during the 1980s, for example, growth in labor productivity averaged just 1.6% per year, compared to the much higher 3.1% yearly growth in productivity during the 2000s. In the countries that remain impoverished, productivity growth tends to remain low and dips frequently into the negative numbers. So, growth in productivity is critical to the advancement of living standards. But what makes productivity rise? Improvements in any of four areas can lead to higher productivity. Think of these as the four pillars of economic growth. They are physical capital, human capital, technological change, and sound governance. We'll take time now to look at each of these four pillars. And as we do so, as you watch this video, you may wish to pause after each one of the four pillars to take some notes, rewind the video, and review something that might be less familiar to you the first time through, or just take a break and then come back to the next pillar and look at one of each of the four pillars at a time. So let's move on to the first pillar, physical capital. Now, let me ask you this question. Have you ever tried to dig a hole without a shovel or write a research paper without a computer? Like you, workers are more productive when they have the right tools, electronic devices, buildings, vehicles, and other forms of physical capital to work with. The total amount of physical capital in a country is called its capital stock. What matters for productivity is not the capital stock itself, but the average amount of capital available per worker. An increase in a country's capital per worker is called capital deepening. To better understand how capital deepening can raise productivity, imagine you and two friends start a tree planting business in your neighborhood. which has you digging a lot of holes. If you have just one shovel for the group, the three of you will have to share it. Your business has just 1/3 of a shovel per worker. Now you can take turns using the shovel, but output per hour, including the hours spent waiting to use the shovel, will be relatively low. If you get a second shovel, your capital per worker rises and the group is more productive. With 3 shovels, you each have your own, and productivity is higher still. Even a 4th shovel would increase productivity because you could use it when one of the others breaks or becomes dull. Up to a point, the more capital you have per worker, the greater your output per hour. The same applies in almost any job and for the economy as a whole. In order to increase the amount of capital per worker, a country's capital stock must increase more rapidly than its workforce. To see why, imagine that your tree planting business went from having 3 shovels to having 6. And suppose that at the same time you brought on 3 more friends to work with you. So you had 6 shovels for 6 workers. With twice the capital and twice the labor, you would end up with the same amount of capital per worker as before, 1 shovel. But if your capital stock doubled from 3 shovels to 6, and the number of workers less than doubled, say it increased from 3 to 5, then capital per worker would rise. There would then be 1 1/3 shovel per worker. Likewise, if a country can increase its capital stock at a faster rate than its workforce, it can achieve capital deepening. The meaning of investment depends on the context, but it usually involves foregoing current benefits for future growth. In our discussion of personal finance in a prior unit, we saw how investments in stocks and bonds can help your wealth grow. In a previous module, we explained that in the context of macroeconomics, investment is primarily spending on physical capital, which helps the economy grow. This includes investment by firms on things like cranes, delivery trucks, computer systems, office cubicles, and assembly lines. It also includes spending on economic infrastructure, which is physical capital that provides a basic foundation that users share for many types of economic activity. Economic infrastructure includes communication systems, such as satellites and fiber optic cable lines, power systems, such as power grids and electricity generation plants, financial systems, such as banks, stock exchanges, and markets for goods and services, and transportation systems, such as railways, highways, bridges, airports, and seaports. Spending on infrastructure includes elements of both private investment and government spending. In order to increase the capital stock, however, investment spending must be greater than what we call depreciation, which is the amount of capital that is used up each year. For example, if a computer is expected to last 3 years, then 1/3 of the computer's productive life is used up each year. If one new computer is purchased every 3 years, the capital stock will not increase because investment is just keeping pace with depreciation. For a given amount of depreciation, more investment spending means more growth in the capital stock. In 2011, investment in the United States topped $2.1 trillion. This represented about 16% of GDP that year. Of the total, firms spent about $1.7 trillion, and federal, state, and local governments spent the remaining $400 billion. In almost all years, U.S. investment spending exceeds depreciation, so the capital stock rises. And although the population is growing at the same time, the capital stock grows faster, resulting in an increase in the capital per worker. This increase in the availability of capital puts more shovels and computers and delivery cars at the disposal of each worker, which explains why investment helps raise productivity. The pie chart in front of you shows that more than half of the private sector's investment dollars was spent on business equipment and software in 2011. The rest is divided between business structures and residential structures. But where do the funds for all this investment come from? Business investment is largely funded with domestic savings. Domestic savings are the portion of a country's total income that is not paid in taxes or spent by households on consumption goods. These savings represent a pool of funds available for investment purposes. Domestic savings flow into financial institutions such as banks, where they can be loaned out to firms. And you saw an illustration of this flow of savings in the previous figure. In a simple world, income would be divided among consumption, taxes, and saving. The government would spend just the amount collected in taxes, and the amount available for business investment would equal the amount saved. Our world is not that simple, however, as you know. To begin with, governments often spend more than they collect in taxes. And when that occurs, the government must borrow funds to fill the gap. So the government then competes with businesses for the pool of available savings, reducing the amount available for private investment. As a second complication, the foreign sector affects the amount of savings available for business investment in a country. For example, Americans make some of their savings available to foreign borrowers, but foreigners make even more of their savings available to American borrowers. Because the U.S. economic and legal systems are so stable, foreigners have traditionally found the United States to be a good place to put their savings. In 2011, for example, international flows of savings into and out of the country added $467 billion to the total available for U.S. borrowers. This was more than 1/5 of the funds used for U.S. investment that year.